what people want to keep as they age in particular, but especially when they feel like they're losing control, even more so because of those types of situations with Alzheimer's and dementia. So today what we're going to be talking about is some ways you can go about making sure you maintain as much control as possible. There's always the possibility that some control will be lost. There's no real bulletproof solution to maintaining control indefinitely, but we can maintain as much control as possible and make sure that you are taken care of or your loved one is taken care of. So welcome everybody. I'm attorney Justin Randall with Hooper Law Office, for those of you who don't know me. For those of you who attended our drive-in movie with Care Patrol last week or the week before, welcome. And so today, like I mentioned, we're going to be talking about maintaining control of your finances as you age. It is definitely one of the biggest concerns we have with people the older generation coming in. One of the biggest things is, well, what do I do? How do I make sure that someone can step in and help me? And how do I make sure that my decisions will be honored? So for those of you who registered at the end of this seminar or webinar, excuse me, you will be receiving an email from us with the materials that we have for today. There will also be an evaluation form that you can fill out. It just, it basically asks, if there's anything you'd like to see us talk about or feedback that you can give, something didn't quite register with you, anything like that, ways we can improve. It's really helpful if you fill those out. It's also a way that if any of this raises any concerns for you, anything we talk about today, and you would like to come in and talk to us, there is a place on that evaluation form where you can fill out that you would like us to reach out to you and set up an initial consultation. Those initial consultations are free. We set them up for 2 hours. They don't necessarily always go that length of time, but they are free, so you don't have to worry about paying us anything to come do that. It's really important that we talk to you if you have concerns. So if you would like us to do that, please fill out that that evaluation form and mark that you would like us to reach out and set up a time to speak. And this is an interactive webinar as well, so you do have the ability to answer, if you registered and you're participating via Zoom, you have the ability to send in Q&A questions for me. We have a Q&A function that if you send it in, I'll see the question and I'll answer it as soon as I can. It's really helpful when you guys send in those questions too, just because I know what you want me to talk about more so. But okay, to get started, what we're going to be doing this entire web series over the next couple of weeks is about maintaining control as you age. Today, particularly, I'll be talking about financial control. So how do you maintain control of your assets as you age? How do you make sure that financially you can do what you need to if you have health concerns or Alzheimer's or dementia diagnoses, things like that? The biggest thing you want to keep in mind is that, do you have any powers of attorney? Do you have a financial power of attorney set up? So financial powers of attorney are documents in which you nominate somebody to step in and make financial decisions and have financial authority for you when you no longer can for yourself. They do not always require you to be declared incapacitated. Often they are what we call immediately effective. So what that means is the moment I've signed to this financial power of attorney, the person I've nominated can step in and help. You don't have to have that declaration of incapacity for it. One really important thing to keep in mind is that not all powers of attorney are created equal. A lot of times people think, well, I have this document in place, so my agent can do whatever they need to for me, whatever that may be. The issue, though, is that powers of attorney, especially financial powers of attorney, are really only as good as the authorities they name or they list specifically in them. If they don't include a certain authority, whether that is going to the bank, writing a check, paying bills, filing your taxes for you, anything like that, well, the question becomes, well, does that agent have that authority to do that? And sometimes people get away with, not having a, explicitly listed authority, and the bank will let them do it because they're interpreting it that way. And that's okay. But the issue you run into is if somebody says, well, that's not how I'm reading it. I don't see that you have that authority very clearly stated in there. So I'm not going to let you write checks, or I'm not going to let you change beneficiary designations on the bank account or close that bank account. To give you an idea of why this can be an issue, a lot of times people will use the state statutory form, which you can download online. Wisconsin has drafted this for the widest audience possible. So it doesn't have a lot of specifics in there of what authorities are included. You'll see things instead like, oh, I want to give my power of attorney agent banking powers or business powers, things like that, but it doesn't explain what that means. So you could interpret banking powers to mean opening and closing a bank account, but it doesn't really say that. So you just run into issues of what am I allowed to do? Is this bank teller going to interpret it differently than I am? Am I going to run into issues with that? So you want to be very explicit. The one thing in particular that we run into issues with powers of attorney for financial powers of attorney is whether or not there is the right amount of authority to do long-term care planning for somebody. So I can guarantee you the Wisconsin state statutory form does not have the right authorities in it to do long-term care planning for somebody. So what I mean by that is it's not going to say, oh, my agent can do long-term care planning for me. Instead, it will say things like, oh, my agent can step in and they can make gifts. They can set up irrevocable trusts. They can file for government benefits, including things like Medicaid. So you want a group of authorities in there to make sure that you have what you need should you not have the mental capacity or legal capacity to sign new documents and get that planning in place for yourself. A couple of really key considerations with financial powers of attorney, and something I always walk through with my clients is, who do you trust to put in that role? Obviously, what I just mentioned is a lot of different very big authorities you're sort of granting to somebody with in regards to controlling finances or making financial decisions for you. So one of the key considerations is do you trust that person to follow your wishes on it? Because you're granting so much authority, that's the biggest thing you want to factor in. If you don't trust someone to make those decisions, you don't want to make sure that, or you do want to make sure, that you trust that person to make the right decisions. If you don't trust them, that's absolutely not the person to name. Some things you don't need to worry about as much with agents that you're naming for financial power of attorney. You don't really need to worry as much about, does this person have the financial background? You don't have to worry about if they're a CPA or a financial advisor or an attorney or anything like that. You just need to make sure that they are trustworthy and that they are responsible. Responsible meaning, do they pay your bills on time? If they are procrastinators and don't get things done, well, that could be an issue for paying your bills if you need them paid. So trustworthiness, responsibility, in terms of getting things done on time, those are really the big considerations. If they have no idea how to play the stock market or what investments are good or how to do financial investing at all, that's not a big deal. They can always hire someone to help them with that if they need to. That's one of the big things that a financial power of attorney may need to do, is talk to your financial advisor for you. So speaking of financial advising, one of the biggest things I recommend that family members do once they do have that power of attorney in place is introduce your son or your daughter or whoever is your power of attorney agent to your financial advisor if you have one, to your attorney, to your CPA. Maintaining control of your finances often involves making sure that the people you nominate for things know where to look. If they don't know where things are, if they don't know who to go talk to, that's not going to help them at all, and it's not going to ultimately help your financial decision making be done in a timely manner. It's just going to be a huge mess. So when you get the opportunity, introduce them to those people you work with, or at least if you don't work with anybody, tell them where you have all your finances. Have a place where they can go look. we often use a document finder in our office where it's saying, here's where I keep all of my legal documents. You can do something similar with a financial list saying, all right, I bank at Associated. I have all my life insurance through Thrivent. I mean, you can go through that sort of process of making sure people know where to look. So buying and selling property is another really big thing that you can do through a financial power of attorney. It's something that may need to happen at some point. So if we're looking at long-term care planning, often selling the home at some point is what comes up, because if somebody doesn't need it anymore, they're not living in it, well, it can just become a financial drain in an otherwise already financially draining situation. So buying and selling property is something you want to be able to do through a financial power of attorney, because it may need to happen at some point. Emergency nursing home planning is really the biggest thing that comes up often in financial power of attorney issues. We need a certain amount or a certain set of authorities listed in a document, a financial power of attorney document, to know that we can do planning for somebody if they do not have the capacity themselves. This is the biggest issue that comes up with financial powers of attorney. Like I mentioned previously, if someone comes into our office on behalf of their parents and says, mom or dad doesn't have capacity anymore, they have an Alzheimer's diagnosis, and they just can't sign things, they can't understand things anymore. Well, if that agent comes in and they don't have the authorities I need to be able to set up planning for them, for the parent, in regards to protecting things from nursing home expenses, or just simple estate planning documents, like a trust, for example. If they don't have those authorities, I can't guarantee that, that we'll be able to help them. So you need those authorities in there that deal with long-term care, whether it's making gifts, setting up a trust of some kind, or dealing with government benefits like Medicaid. That's how or I can comfortably say, okay, we can step in and help. We can follow your parents' wishes and make sure that their assets are protected from long-term care expenses, and having to spend down for Medicaid, for example. The question often becomes, what happens if we don't have these in place? What happens if I don't have a financial power of attorney and I do lose capacity? Well, first and foremost, that's the biggest loss of control you can run into. So, like I mentioned previously, there's always some level of control as we age that we lose. There's no way to guarantee 100% that you'll never lose control, no matter what documents you put into place. As we age, things change for us, and maybe our mental capacity changes. So you may have to give up some level of control at some point. But if you do nothing and you don't put any document in place, you don't nominate powers of attorney agents to act on your behalf, you're not putting any control in place. You're not maintaining any control, because you're not even picking who is in charge of those things for yourself anymore. If you don't have a power of attorney for finance in place and you lose capacity, the only way that your family can step in and help make decisions for you and make financial decisions for you is a process known as guardianship. So guardianship comes up for a lot of different reasons. Sometimes it's health reasons, sometimes it's financial reasons. And I don't mean to knock on it. I mean, there are perfectly valid reasons that you need a guardianship for people. But if the only reason you're going to guardianship is because you do not have a financial power of attorney and you need to get decision-making authority over somebody, it's otherwise avoidable. If they've signed a financial power of attorney with those authorities you need, you don't necessarily need to go through the guardianship court just to be able to step in and help. But without that power of attorney signed, you do run into that issue where the only way someone is going to be able to get that authority, if the person themselves no longer has capacity, is getting it from the court and essentially you're taking rights from that person. So guardianship is I would say, generally the most invasive into someone's life and their rights, decision-making rights, as opposed to, getting a power of attorney for finance in place. really the big difference between the two, I would say, in terms of decision-making authority. If somebody has a power of attorney in place, you're not actually giving up any rights. You're just sort of duplicating your authority, sharing that authority with the agent you've nominated, not giving it up over yourself. You, as what's called the principal of the power of attorney, the person who signed it and nominated an agent, you still have all of those decision-making abilities over yourself. Nobody can say, I'm going to tell you you can't do that just because they're your power of attorney agent. Whereas with a guardianship, what most often is happening is you're saying, all right, which rights am I taking over for that person? Which abilities am I saying they no longer have themselves that I now have for them if I am the guardian? So it tends to be the most invasive. And in terms of maintaining control, it's the biggest loss of control that somebody could have. Whereas the control you're maintaining with a financial power of attorney in particular is at the very least, the decision over who is going to manage things for you. But really, for the most part, unless there is a real reason that you can't make those decisions yourself, you maintain control over everything. It's merely providing someone else the ability to step in and help you if something happens, like an accident or a sudden decline in health. Somebody needs to make those decisions for you. So those tend to be the biggest issues we run into with financial powers of attorney. When it comes to nursing home planning, that tends to be the biggest loss of control that people are afraid of. I mean, the biggest loss of control I can think of outside of just giving it away to somebody is the complete, spend down of all of your assets to when you have no assets remaining. So part of maintaining control over your finances is also maintaining control over how you spend your money for your care, where you receive that care, things of that nature. So that is a huge part of this type of planning, is making sure that you can maintain control over what type of care you're receiving and can you afford it. As many of you I'm sure are aware, nursing home expenses, assisted living expenses, long-term care expenses in general are astronomically high. To give you a kind of an estimate, the average assisted living facility could be anywhere between $5,000 and $7,000 a month, depending on the care level that somebody needs. A full skilled nursing facility is closer to $10,000 to $11,000 a month. And that's not a national average either. That's, right here in Wisconsin and in the Fox Valley that we have those types of prices. So, looking at potentially $100,000 a year or more in expenses, that's where you run into, well, a lot of people are going to run out of money if we need care long enough. So I did just get a question, and the question is, what happens if your assets aren't enough to be able to afford this care? So that is where a lot of our planning comes into play. So when someone does not have enough, a large enough estate or a large enough collection of assets to pay for their care indefinitely, one of two things is going to tend to happen. One, maybe they don't even have enough for one full year of care. What happens then is you have to spend down to a certain point, and at the point where you are financially qualified for Medicaid and care-wise qualified for Medicaid, that's when Medicaid, not Medicare, but Medicaid steps in and starts paying the bill for your nursing home expenses. So that's kind of when you do nothing at all, that's what tends to happen. If you spend down to the point where you just have so little at that point that you are qualified for Medicaid. So when people talk about nursing homes taking things, they're not actually talking about, the nursing home doesn't just go in and take everything in advance. They're not, forcing you to give over control, and they're not forcing you to sell the home. It's just that it's so expensive that people tend to spend through everything they have, depending on the size of their estate again and their income. They tend to spend through everything, and then Medicaid says you're only allowed to have so much before we step in and help. So that's where you're really getting it taken from you, is you're just spending through it, and Medicaid has requirements of how you financially qualify. So if you don't have enough, if the concern is I don't have enough for this care, There's a couple of options you want to look at first. One, if you are usually in your 50s to maybe mid 60s, is a good time to look at long-term care insurance. That's the first and foremost way I would recommend somebody to go if they have concerns about long-term care expenses. It can be expensive itself, but the only way you know if it's expensive for you is if you get a quote on it. Don't listen to Bob down the street and Bob said it was expensive, so I'm not going to get it. But Bob's quote might have been higher because of his health. You want to at least get a look into it yourself. The reason I say your 50s to your mid to later 60s is because usually if you get into your 70s and later, it gets very expensive, even more so. So you want to look at it earlier rather than later. So long-term care insurance, for those of you who don't know, is something that rather than you paying for, out of pocket for everything for long-term care expenses, it's a type of insurance that specifically covers usually at home or nursing home or assisted living level care, and usually has a maximum amount it pays out. So, it might say, oh, we'll pay out a maximum of $300,000 over the term of this policy. So at nursing home level care, that would cover about 3 years of care with that amount. So that's the first step when you're looking at, well, personally, I don't have enough money to pay for all of this, which would cover a lot of people. I mean, it is very expensive. So look at long-term care insurance first. Then if you're concerned about not having enough to pay for care for more than a certain period of time, that's when you can look at protecting assets through legal planning. So often what we'll look at doing is have the estate plan set up in such a way that we have certain types of legal documents we use, most often an irrevocable trust, for example, that we say, all right, these sets of assets or the home or this life insurance policy or this investment account, you kind of pick and choose which assets you want to protect from your care that you never want to have to spend on your care if you can avoid it. That does a couple of things. It gives you more long-term control over the decision making over those assets because you're selecting who's in charge of that trust. Can't be yourself necessarily, but you can still select it as one of the kids, kind of like you would have power of attorney, right? But then when it comes time to apply for Medicaid, when you've run out of your own assets at that point, and you do now financially qualify for Medicaid, if you've made it out more than 5 years from the date of setting up that type of trust, it no longer counts against you for Medicaid. So Medicaid can't look at that asset and say, that's yours, you have to spend it down before we get to that point, before we step in and help you, I mean. So that's, there's a variety of ways to do this type of planning and make sure that you can control your assets to the point of not having to spend down if you don't want to. So we'll also be covering in the upcoming, I believe next week, we're talking about healthcare power of attorney documents, and the weeks after that, more about how you control what type of care you receive. So we'll also be kind of diving into that more in depth than I just did there about that type of planning and choosing your care and how to maintain a certain quality of care, even if affording it becomes a concern, right? So tune in for our next couple of sessions as well, and we'll talk even more about that. And especially if you have those types of concerns for your parent, where you're saying, hey, mom and dad, they maybe have maybe a couple $100,000 estate. Maybe the home is their main asset and they don't have a lot of liquid cash available for care. How do we stop it so that they don't have to sell the home and give it up and pay down to nothing before we help them get qualified for Medicaid, especially if care is coming up? So there's, like I said, there's a lot of ways you can do that planning, but the biggest way that you make sure you're able to do that planning is to have a financial power of attorney in place for your loved ones or for yourself that says the person I've nominated to take over for me if I can't make these decisions myself has the ability to do essentially Medicaid protection planning. Again, it usually won't say that specifically. It'll say setting up trusts and making gifts and things like that. So those documents, or excuse me, that document, the financial power of attorney, is the document that is going to give you the most protection to do that planning, if you can't yourself. Obviously, it is always ideal to do that planning while you are still able to make that decision yourself. You generally don't want to wait to the point where you have to have a power of attorney do that for you, but it at least gives you that buffer to say, hey, if I can't do it myself, someone else can step in and do it for me. And the person I've trusted enough to name is the one that's going to do that. But yes, it's always best to do it yourself first while you can, especially because of the 5-year look back period for Medicaid. You really want to make sure you have the authority, or you have the protection you need in place long before you ever need it. If we were able to do it overnight, nobody would ever do it in advance. They'd all just wait until they needed care to do it overnight. And the way you guarantee you protect the largest amount of your assets and the largest percentage of your estate is to do it well before you need to do it. That doesn't mean go out and do it if you're 25. I mean, that would be a little soon, I think, for most people. But once you're retired and you look at it and say, well, I'm in my early 60s or mid 60s. I mean, it can vary for a lot of different reasons. That's not a set age by any means, but those are the types of times you want to look at it. Here's how I can, I have a big enough grasp of my estate to understand what I can live on and what asset I no longer need direct access to. Yeah, I mean, that was a great question, and I know I went very long-winded on it, so hopefully I answered your question well enough, but there are ways you can do that planning. And if you have a loved one that you need to do that planning for, and you would like us to take a look at the power of attorney and see what we can do, absolutely fill out the evaluation form at the end and just let us know that you would like to set up a time to talk with us. Just so everyone's aware, we are still doing phone conferences and web conferences. So it would really be no different than you and I having this conversation, seeing me just like this. So we're doing that to keep everyone safe, obviously. But yeah, please fill that out and come talk to us if you have a big enough concern that you're saying, I need to help my mom or my dad or my loved one. So we have just a few minutes left here. So I do want to thank everybody for coming and watching watching me, excuse me, talk about this topic. I hope you guys found this very useful, and keep in mind, if you have concerns about healthcare concerns, about healthcare decision-making, things like that, we will be covering healthcare powers of attorney next week and how to maintain control over those types of decisions. And then in the weeks following that, we're going to be talking about maintaining decision-making control over what type of care you receive and where you're able to receive that care. So again, please fill out those evaluation forms. Even if you don't want us to reach out and contact you, if you have any sort of feedback and you would like us to cover any specific topics going forward, it's helpful to us. So I just want to say thank you guys for coming and watching me rattle off some information at you for